Hello and welcome to everyone who has joined us for the live debut of a lecture titled A Sacrifice to the Rage of a Misguided People, The Revolutionary War Adventures of New York Loyalist John Peters, delivered by Todd Braisted. We're very pleased to have Mr. Braisted with us today, especially given the Father's Day weekend. We're also pleased to have everyone here in attendance, and we're happy you made us part of your plans. So, to say a little bit about our speaker, Todd Braisted is an author, an independent researcher specializing in Loyalist studies during the American Revolution. He has published over 60 books and journal articles on a variety of period subjects, including the 2016 book Grand Forage 1778. His website, royalprovincial.com, is the leading site for Loyalist research since it debuted in 2000. Todd has likewise appeared as a guest historian on such television shows as History Detectives and Who Do You Think You Are? Over the past 4 decades, he has served as president of the Bergen County Historical Society and the Brigade of the American Revolution, and as a fellow in the Company of Military Historians. He likewise serves as a member of Revolution NJ, the state's advisory council for the semi-quincentennial, is editor-in-chief of the Papers of Francis Lord Rawdon for the South Carolina American Revolution Sesquicentennial Commission, and a consultant for the Museum of the American Revolution. In 2017, Todd wrote the National Park Service Battlefield Studies Preservation Report for Fort Lee, New Jersey. He has taught numerous classes for Fort Ticonderoga's National Endowment for the Humanities Teachers Program and Teachers Institute. In 2018, he received the Award of Recognition from the New Jersey Historical Commission, and in 2026, the History Medal from the Daughters of the American Revolution. He's lectured extensively on Loyalists and other subjects across the United States and Canada, and we are very pleased to welcome him today. So without further ado, Mr. Todd Braisted.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hoping everyone can hear me okay as we come to you from the great state of New Jersey. First off, thank you to the state of New York and Bennington Battlefield for having me today. Like many of you, I watched the Ken Burns American Revolution documentary this past November, curious about what stories would be told, what individuals would be focused on to tell the tales. I have to tell you, I was not expecting John Peters to represent the Loyalists. Well, first off, no one knows how many Loyalists there were in America at the time. Hundreds of thousands for sure. So the number of possible choices is pretty large. Peters was not a minor player, a common sort, but neither was he of the upper tier of society. So not a bad choice overall. As to why, the answer may lay in his papers. There are two major collections of John Peters papers, both within New York. One at the New York Historical Society in Manhattan, the other at the New York State Library in Albany. Needless to say, I've been through both of them. What I would like to do today is focus on one of those documents, a narrative that Peters himself wrote shortly before his death in 1788, and let him tell the story. However, as the old Russian saying goes, trust but verify. We have the ability, I would say duty, today to examine the story and see what is true and where Peters has strayed from the facts. Trust me, he definitely did. I regret the PBS show took all of Peters' words perhaps as gospel truth, but we can delve a little deeper today. As an historian, these bad boys who play fast and loose with the facts are actually more fun than the upright and proper people, more of a challenge in uncovering the truth and more satisfaction when you do. So let's give it a shot. John Peters was born at Hebron in Connecticut in 1740. His father was a wealthy farmer and colonel of the militia. He descended by his father from William Peters, a brother of Hugh Peters, Oliver Cromwell's chaplain, and of an ancient family in Cornwall, England, and by his mother from Major General Thomas Harrison, the regicide. His mother was daughter of Joseph Phelps, a descendant of John Phelps, a considerable man in Cromwell's party. He had a liberal education at Yale College in Connecticut and received a degree of Bachelor of Arts in 1759. In 1761, he married Anne, daughter of Robert Barnett, a merchant at Windsor in Connecticut, who was likewise born in 1740, and by the mid-1780s was the mother of 8 sons and 1 daughter. By way of full disclosure, that is not the house of John Peters on your screen, but rather his uncle, the Reverend Samuel Peters, who we will hear more of shortly. 1763, John Peters moved to Piermont, New Hampshire, on the east bank of Connecticut River, where he had a tract of land and had built a house, a sawmill, and a barn. He was by Royal Governor Benning Wentworth appointed captain of the militia and deputy surveyor of the King's Woods. In 1770, he removed to Mooretown on the west side of Connecticut River, where he had a large parcel of land, and likewise built a house, barn, saw, and grist mill, and carried on husbandry. Being now in Gloucester County in the province of New York, he was appointed by Royal Governor William Tryon to be colonel of the militia, justice of the peace, judge of probate, register of the county, clerk of the court, and judge of the Court of Common Pleas. I would not want that on one business card. Here he was, in his words, in easy circumstances and as independent as my mind ever wished. 1774, the spirit of discord and rebellion, as Peters put it, so far prevailed as to occasion him much trouble. The Congress was forming through the colonies. The counties of Cumberland and Gloucester desired him to attend the Congress to meet at Philadelphia in 1774, which appointment he accepted of. Peters appears to have done little or nothing in Congress, stating, quote, "My uncle advised me to meet the Congress to find out what their aim was. I did so, and being certainly convinced that nothing short of independence would satisfy them, I refused to take the oath of secrecy in Congress and wrote to my uncle, who had been forced to fly to England, telling him what to expect. And I returned to my family at Vermont." Well, it was the trip to and from Vermont that was the real adventure. Of all the members of the Peters family, it was his uncle Samuel Peters who was probably most prominent. That is him up on your screen there. Samuel Peters was an Episcopal clergyman, born at Hebron in 1735, and graduated at Yale College in 1757 with a doctorate in divinity. In 1762, he took charge of the churches at Hebron and Hartford, which lasted until his nephew came calling in 1774. According to John, quote, "I was mobbed with my uncles, the Reverend Mr. Samuel Peters, Mr. Jonathan, and Mr. Bemsley Peters, by Governor Trumbull's Liberty Boys, because we were accused of loyalty. I was liberated after suffering much ill language from the mob. The Reverend Mr. Peters suffered more than I did. He and I there agreed in opinion that the bankrupts, dissenting teachers, and smugglers meant to have a serious rebellion and a civil and religious separation from the mother country. Samuel Peters was made by a mob of 300 men to sign a paper saying he had never written to England with disparaging remarks about the proceedings of those in agitation. Indeed, John Peters took pen to paper and had published a piece in the newspaper chastising those who mobbed his uncles, writing, quote, "For doth not liberty herself allow every man to enjoy his own sentiments? Doth not she allow him to enjoy his leisure hours and contemplation? Does she forbid him committing by ink to paper his thoughts?" The chastisements abated the mob, but briefly. What you see on the screen is actually just the last paragraph of a lengthier piece written by Peters that he had published. The mob soon returned with the same accusations, this time forcing Samuel Peters to fly to Boston. Under the protection of the British Army there, he wrote to his mother and other friends back in Hebron, which letters were, of course, intercepted and published. To his mother, he had written, quote, "I am in high spirits. I should be happy if my friends and relations at Hebron were provided for at these bad times when things are growing worse. 6 regiments are now coming from England and sundry men of war. So soon as they come, hanging work will go on, and destruction will first attend the seaport towns." Samuel left for England at this point. John Peters' journey home from Philadelphia was anything but dull. As he later wrote, quote, "On my way home, I was seized by 3 mobs, ill-treated and dismissed at Wethersfield, Hartford, and Springfield. In April 1775, I arrived at my house in Mooretown, where another mob seized me and threatened to execute me as an enemy to Congress. They then carried me to the committee, who ordered me to jail and discharged me the same evening at 12 o'clock because they had not found proof of my correspondence with General Carleton, on pretense of which I had been committed to prison. Soon after, another mob seized me." There's a lot of mobs in New England. "And insisted I should sign their covenant, which was to oppose the king and British army with my life and property, which covenant I did not sign, and begged time for consideration under bonds, which was granted. In the meantime, news arrived that the British troops had marched out of Boston and were murdering the inhabitants, both young and old, whereupon the committee required me to give orders to the militia to be ready at an hour's warning to march against the Royalists. I gave the orders. This gained much favor for a few days with the mob. However, as the reports of the massacre near Boston by the king's troops dwindled, the mob renewed their attacks upon me. They searched my house for letters of secret correspondence with General Carleton, with whom, in fact, I never had corresponded, but took away all papers found in my house, insulted me, and required me to sign deeds of some lands I had bought, confined me to the limits of town, and threatened me with death if I transgressed their orders. The mob again and again visited me and ate and drank and finally plundered me of most of my movable effects. Added to this, my father, Colonel Peters of Hebron, wrote against me and urged on the mobs, assigning for reason, quote, that his uncle Peters, the clergyman who had taught him bad principles, was driven out of the country, and that he would soon become a friend to America if severity was used. Well, I know who's not getting a Father's Day card tomorrow. At this point, John Peters outwardly appeared to join the rebellion, attaching himself to the New Hampshire Rangers, commanded by Colonel Timothy Bedell. He accompanied the regiment to Canada in March 1776. According to Peters, he not only talked Bedell out of burning the village of Cedars in Quebec, but clandestinely sent information to Captain George Forster, commanding a mixed force of British regulars, Canadian militia, and native warriors, leading to the capture of the Americans there under Major Isaac Butterfield, Bedell's second in command. They then defeated a relief force of Continentals under Major Henry Sherburne. Peters took credit for this victory, writing, quote, I sent Captain Foster proper information, which enabled him to form an ambuscade, whereby he took and killed near 150 rebels. The Indians were enraged with the rebels because some of their friends had been killed in the skirmish, and they killed several captives. And to stop their outrage, Captain Foster gave them 8 yoke of oxen and some cows. Remaining in Canada without yet being suspected, Peters then went to Montreal, saying, quote, "In Montreal, I met with Dr. Franklin and others, the commissioners from Congress, and also General Worcester and Colonel Arnold, and we dined together when Arnold said, quote, 'Nothing but independence would settle these matters, and wish to God it was now done.'" Peters then claimed to have been privy to a conversation where it was discussed that a Continental force of 700 men under a Colonel Daniel Hawes and another under Arnold would set out to destroy Captain Forster. Having secretly sent word to Forster, who escaped the trap, he was still in Montreal when Arnold returned, and according to Peters, quote, "gave private orders to plunder and burn the city of Montreal. I discovered this by Mr. Wheatley of Norwich in Connecticut, who with Arnold was to share the profits, and Mr. Wheatley offered me part, if I would join him. I thanked Mr. Wheatley for his friendship, desiring a few hours to consider of it, and went and informed the inhabitants of the design, and they set a watch over the city till Arnold left the town." From Montreal, Peters then, quote, "went to Sorel, where General Sullivan," that happy-looking fellow on the screen there, "commanded. He took me a prisoner on suspicion that I had given Captain Forster and the Indians of Conestoga information of their intentions, and sent me to St. John's. The rebels burnt Chambly and St. John's on the way to Gail-La-Motte, where we rested 6 days, and where I was set at liberty, because they had no proof against me, except what arose from a letter that Deacon Bailey from Mooretown wrote to General Sullivan, quote, to take care of Colonel Peters, who was an enemy to America, and would escape to General Carleton the first opportunity. General Sullivan and his army set off for Crown Point, and I had retired to the woods on the Gail-La-Motte and returned in the evening of June 28th to the deserted camp, where I found a canoe, which Dr. Joseph Skinner, who had also escaped, and I seized and paddled off in to St. John's, near 40 miles, where we met General Simon Fraser, 29th June. At this point, Peters was a committed loyalist. He put himself under the command of the British Commander-in-Chief, Sir Guy Carleton, and accompanied him and the British Army to Crown Point that autumn before they withdrew to winter quarters. Having had information of Peters joining the British, Deacon Bailey in Mooretown had the Loyalist property confiscated and his family turned out of doors in January 1777, sending them away 140 miles to Ticonderoga, where they were used kindly and treated with humanity by Anthony Wayne. In April 1777, Wayne sent Anne and her children on their way north with 3 weeks of provisions. They got 50 miles until rescued by a British vessel, which brought them to St. John's on May 4th. Joining them 2 days later, John Peters found them, quote, well, but naked and dirty. After a harrowing ordeal of settling his family in Montreal, Peters returned to the army, which was gathering not under Sir Guy Carleton, but under his immediate subordinate, Lieutenant General John Burgoyne, the dashing fellow you see on the screen. Burgoyne had lobbied hard in London the previous winter for permission to lead an army south from Quebec and subdue the rebellion at least as far as Albany. He gathered an army made up of 9,000 British, German, Loyalist, and Canadian troops, as well as a contingent of native warriors. Before setting off, he declared his intentions to the world boldly, stating in part, quote, and you can listen to this in the most pompous voice you wish, The intention of this address is to hold forth security, not depredation to the country. To those whom spirit and principle may induce to partake the glorious task of redeeming their countrymen from dungeons and reestablishing the blessings of legal government, I offer encouragement and employment, and upon the first intelligence of their associations, I will find means to assist their undertakings. The domestic, the industrious, the infirm, and even the timid inhabitants I am desirous to protect, provided they remain quietly in their houses, that they do not suffer their cattle to be removed, nor their corn or forage to be secreted or destroyed, that they do not break up their bridges or roads, nor by any other acts directly or indirectly endeavor to obstruct the operations of the king's troops, or supply or assist those of the enemy. John Peters would be a part of that effort, as on May 28, 1777, Burgoyne appointed him Lieutenant Colonel Commandant with authority to raise a new Loyalist regiment, the Queen's Loyal Rangers. Loyalist units had been raised from the very beginning of the war in all the areas occupied by the British. In the Northern Army, the 1st Battalion Royal Highland immigrants had taken part in the defense of Quebec and were instrumental in defending that city during siege. The King's Royal Regiment of New York was formed in June 1776 by Sir John Johnson, mostly from his tenants in the Mohawk Valley. These were provincial units, officers and men duly commissioned and enlisted by the British to receive pay, clothing, arms, accoutrements, rations, equipage, etc., the same as the British, and to be under the same discipline. Sir John's regiment would be part of a simultaneous expedition against Fort Stanwix, while the immigrants were left behind to maintain the garrisons in Canada. There would be a number of new groups raised during the Burgoyne campaign, which circumstance would be a pain in the backside for all concerned for years to come. The new corps were the King's Loyal Americans, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Ebenezer Jessup, and raised in November 1776 from about 80 Loyalists who joined the army under Sir Guy Carleton at Crown Point. 7 companies were formed until August 8, 1777, when Captain Monroe's Bateau Company then transferred to McAlpin's Corps. It raised 334 officers and men, some 78 of whom were transferred to other corps during the campaign. And yes, we have the Queen's Loyal Rangers, raised by our friend John Peters. You have McAlpin's Corps of Royalists, raised by Captain Daniel McAlpin on August 1st, 1777. Little is known of their organization in the campaign, other than they fielded at least 210 officers and men. McAlpin would command them until his death in July 1780. Pfister's Corps of Royalists, raised August 15, 1777, by Francis Pfister of Hoosick, New York. 7 companies, totaling 365 officers and men in the campaign. Pfister's command lasted 24 hours, being killed at the Battle of Bennington the next day. Burgoyne tasked Captain Samuel McKay, formerly of the 60th Regiment, to take over the corps. McKay led the bulk of the men to safety in Canada when Burgoyne surrendered, where he was promptly removed from any more service and replaced by Major Robert Leake for the remainder of the war. The smallest of the Royalist Corps was the one commanded by Captain Samuel Adams, a physician from Arlington, Charlotte County, New York. He joined the British at the end of 76 with 5 of his sons serving under him, and another as an officer under Ebenezer Jessup. His company of at least 37 officers and men was divided into Rangers and Bateaumen, the latter under Captain Jephthah Hawley. Speaking of Bateaumen, Captain Peter Van Alstyne in September 77 would command a company of 27 of them. The survivors in 1778 received permission to remove to New York City, where they continued in a similar service. And lastly, Captain Hazard Wilcox of Williamsick, New York, would command a 24-man pioneer company that did not survive the campaign. Wilcox would survive 1777, but not the war, being killed serving as a captain of cavalry in the Westchester militia in an attack in that county in February 1780. So there are all your players. Those are all the units that were raised during the Burgoyne campaign, a not insignificant number. Of the original members of the Royalist units, we know the nativity of some 310 of them. Not surprising, almost 5 of 6 were born in America. An examination of 163 post-war claims shows where they resided when they left to join the Army. Again, not surprisingly, 141, the vast majority, were from New York. 14 were from Vermont, 3 were from Connecticut, 2 from New Hampshire, 2 from Massachusetts, and 1 from New Jersey. And for the record, that last one was not me. While Burgoyne was busy raising troops, he brought scant few military items with him for them. Faced with a lack of arms, uniforms, accoutrements, etc., these new corps, collectively called Royalists, were left to get by on their own as best they could and their officers could. The Army as a whole, however, had, by design, outrun its supply line. Fort Ticonderoga quickly fell in early July 77, followed up quickly again by the Battle of Hubbardton and a push south. By August, Burgoyne's army needed more food and other essentials. He decided that a force primarily of Brunswick and Loyalist troops should proceed to Bennington for such relief, and from there continue south. As Peters recalled in 1779, quote, "At Fort Miller, the general ordered a party to proceed to Albany on Connecticut Road through Bennington, only 60 miles out of the way, in a wilderness where nothing could be obtained if they met with success, and 100 to 1 against success. This order was refused by several provincial colonels because they knew the certain danger and the mountains between which they must pass. General Fraser gave countenance to the provincial colonels, for which General Burgoyne told General Fraser, 'When I want your advice, I shall ask for it.' The general added that the Americans were cowards and disobedient, and by that he means the Loyalists. At this, Colonel Peters told the general that he was ready to obey his orders, but we shall not return. To be sure, I repeat, I am not an authority on the Battle of Bennington. The wonderful people at the park can give you much better knowledge and information than I can about all the players involved and all the actions. So we will confine our story to Peters himself. Quote, August the 16th, 1777, I commanded the Loyalists at Bennington, where I had 291 men of my regiment with me, and I lost above half of them in that engagement. The action commenced about 9 o'clock in the morning and continued till near 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when we retired in much confusion. A little before the Royalists gave way, the rebels pushed with a strong party on the front of the Loyalists, where I commanded. As they were coming up, I observed a man fire at me, which I returned. He loaded again as he came up and discharged again at me, and crying out, "Peters, you damn Tory, I have got you." He rushed on me with his bayonet, which entered just below my left breast, but was turned by the bone. By this time I was loaded, and I saw that it was a rebel captain. He didn't name the name. An old schoolfellow and playmate, and a cousin of my wife's. Though his bayonet was in my body, I felt regret at being obliged to destroy him. We retreated from Bennington to the reinforcement that was coming up, which was soon attacked and obliged to retreat to the bridge at the mill in Cambridge, which I broke up after the troops had retreated over it. and the same evening we retreated towards the camp, which we reached the next day. With the defeat of that wing of the army, it set in motion the remaining actions and defeats to come. But let's for a moment look at Bennington, because it is here that over the course of the war and afterwards, Peters stretches the bounds of accuracy. The account I read above, Peters claimed to have 291 men of the Queen's Loyal Rangers there. At that time, there were but 5 companies of the unit formed. During the entire Burgoyne campaign, the unit would enlist 372 officers and men. However, 94 of that number joined Peters on the retreat from Bennington, being the companies raised by Jeremiah French and Andrew Palmetier. These 2 men had actually received warrants from a provincial brigadier general of the army in America, Montfort Brown, for a brigade he was attempting to raise around New York City, which would become the Prince of Wales American Volunteers. Subtracting those 94 from 372 leaves 278. Take all these numbers down. There will be a test later. Given other casualties before Bennington and no other recruits afterwards, and Peters' top force at Bennington was more in the range of 225 officers and men. But in other accounts, his numbers keep going up. On July 2nd, 1778, Peters claimed to General Haldeman, quote, that at the action at Bennington, the 16th of August, lost, killed, taken, and missing 200 out of 270 out of the corps that were there with him. After the war, Samuel Peters, describing his nephew as the best woodsman in the army, claimed he had lost over 500 men at Bennington. Samuel, of course, was in England at the time. He could only have gotten that information from his nephew John. In 1779, John claimed the biggest number of all, stating, quote, Peters returned to the Royal Army at Saratoga with only 117 of his regiment, which contained 603. If you took all the officers and men who served in the Corps through November of 1781, well past Bennington, you only get 565. Attached primarily to General Simon Fraser's advance guard, the different Royalist corps suffered accordingly, losing combined some 700 officers and men, dead, killed in action, deserted, discharged, taken prisoner, or just plain disappeared from July through October 1777. John Peters, himself wounded at Bennington, describing his post-battle ailments, quote, General Fraser received me very kindly. As I was wounded in the breast, I was also lame with a hurt I received in a skirmish the day before the action by a ball grazing my foot. I was much fatigued, and for some time had been harassed with a fever and ague. He generously gave me up his bed for the night, and he laid himself in his cloak upon a bench. I received his and General Burgoyne's approbation for my conduct in the action. Now, official returns of the Queen's Loyal Rangers show a total of 301 of all ranks in the unit on August 7th, of whom only 180 rank and file were present and fit for duty. Just less than 2 months later, the number is 183 all ranks, with just 46 rank and file present fit for duty. Both returns were signed by Peters, as you will see by that return on your screen. So, what figures were correct? When you examine the actual rolls of the regiment found at the New York State Library in the Peters papers, we see for the action at Bennington, for which there are dates of enlistment and no contradictory information, 2 killed and 27 taken prisoner among the enlisted men, along with Captain David McFall taken prisoner with Lieutenant John Hogle Sr. and Ensign Abel Benedict killed. We know at least Peters was wounded, as well as Quartermaster Sergeant Garrett Miller. However, there are others listed, some on these rolls, some on much later rolls, many of whom do not have dates of enlistment and whose actual existence cannot be verified. 13 privates were listed as either killed or taken prisoner at Bennington, none of whom appear on the 1777 rolls. Then it gets more interesting. We have James Baxter, not listed for 3 years, then prisoner on August 16, 1777. Adam Best, transferred to Pfister's Corps on August 22nd, but also listed by Peters as taken prisoner on August 16th. Henry Best, not listed for 3 years, then prisoner, August 16, 77. Stephen Bedell, transferred to McAlpin's Corps, September 8, 1777, also claimed by Peters at different times as both killed and taken prisoner at Bennington, plus 18 others of similar discrepancies. No need to go through any more there. If you allow every discrepancy at face value, the Queen's Loyal Rangers suffered 69 dead or captured. Given the shoddy paperwork, it was almost certainly less than that. For the entire campaign, we know for fact the regiment lost some 11 killed, including the 2 officers, almost all after Bennington. So who really did suffer the most at Bennington? Without doubt, it was the Corps then just joining the Army, that commanded by Colonel Francis Pfister. Their return, made out on December 20th, 1777, was just 4 months removed from the battle, not several years. Pfister himself, of course, was killed. John Macomb, Pfister's father-in-law and a staff officer to the Royalist Corps, said 318 men out of 500 raised were engaged at Bennington, and a total of 365 present in the campaign. Their December 77 return lists by name 190 men taken prisoner and 15 killed, not including Pfister, but one other officer, Ensign Henry Doubt. 9 others died after the campaign, possibly some of wounds. Pfister's Corps was then taken over by Captain Samuel Mackay, who brought off all but 27 officers and men to Canada before the surrender at Saratoga. Sir Guy Carleton despised Mackay, who had formerly commanded one of 3 Canadian companies during the campaign, and instantly dismissed him, replacing him with Captain Robert Leake of New York. The first of the 2 major actions, collectively known as the Battle of Saratoga, took place on the farm of Loyalist John Freeman, 19 September 1777. The different Royalist Corps were primarily on the left of the British line during the action. Peters himself had very little to say on it. Quote, "The Royal Army kept their ground at Stillwater till September 19th, when the rebels attacked our works in the morning, and the attack continued till dark. The Royal Army, having suffered much, and General Fraser being mortally wounded, they retreated to Saratoga." Again, the rolls that appear most accurate list absolutely no casualties for the Corps in the action. However, a return from December 1780 lists 24 men taken prisoner that day, none of whom are on the 1777 rolls. Realizing victory was not going to favor him, very much outnumbered and with little hope of support, Burgoyne dug in at Saratoga and looked for a way back north. On October 7th, the second major battle occurred, this one definitely involving at least some of the Corps, 6 of Captain Simeon Koval's company of the Queen's Loyal Rangers being taken prisoner that day. With the writing on the wall, and having experienced rebel hospitality before, Peters requested permission to attempt to break out and return to Canada, rather than take his chances with his fellow countrymen. Peters appeared to have received permission to do just that, as this note from Second-in-Command Major General William Phillips shows. On the 15th of October, Peters did just that, leading 157 officers and men safely north to Ticonderoga and then Canada. However, in his testimony before Parliament upon returning to England, Burgoyne tried to lay the blame not at his own hubris, but on others, particularly the Loyalists, stating, quote, that his defeat or convention at Saratoga in 1777 was brought on him by the ill conduct of the Indians, Canadians, and provincials, on whom he found too late was no dependence. This from the man who had brought not one coat or musket for them. Peters justifiably continued, quote, the provincials further say that if General Burgoyne had condescended to the advice of those who knew the country and had stayed at Fort Miller till he could hear from New York, all America could not have tarnished his glory, nor hurt or starved his army. The provincials think themselves ill-treated as their characters are wounded by the general for whom they went to die and offered to die to save him if he would retreat from Saratoga to Fort Miller, a thing no way impossible in their opinion. Peters would continue this assault on Burgoyne until his dying day. After Burgoyne's captivity obliged his departure from the scene, Sir Guy Carleton, wishing for a change of scenery as well, the new commander would be a Swiss, Lieutenant General Frederick Haldimand, a man who knew nothing about the raising of any of the Royalist corps or their trials or tribulations. Things were actually going to get worse. That's Haldimand on the right of the screen. That's Carleton going bye-bye on the left. Trust me, he's happy he's going. Soon after taking command, Haldimand, perhaps wishing to find out which of his new subordinates had talent, picked Peters to lead a small expedition to Vermont, issuing the following orders to him on July 25th, 1778. Having thought fit that a discovering party should be sent towards the provinces upon the frontiers of this government, you are for that purpose to take under your command and direction a party to consist of 100 men with proper officers from the different bodies of Royalists attached to the corps. A small body of Indians will be added to your detachment for the purposes of scouring the woods and securing your march, as you shall proceed, but you are to take special care that proper persons of your appointing, and for whom you can be responsible, shall accompany them upon all occasions, in order to prevent entirely all acts of cruelty or inhumanity from being committed by them. Arms, ammunition, provisions, and boats would be made available to them. However, passing in the mail was a letter apparently written by Peters to General Powell discussing the makeup of the corps and the transferring of his men to other Royalist battalions. This appears to have confused Haldimand, who sent after Peters with new instructions on August 9th, stating, quote, I did not desire that any person should be employed upon the service you have undertaken, but such as should go with their own free will and choice. And if there are any now with you who disapprove of it, they have my permission to return. But I must desire you will inform me of it and what number leaves you. Peters, stating the above to his expedition, two brother officers of McAlpin's corps, William and Thomas Fraser, immediately marched back to Canada with all the native tribesmen and 2/3 of the Royalists, leaving Peters with just 34 men, who, according to Peters, quote, whom I proceeded to the head of Onion River, and following it down, we destroyed the blockhouse and all the buildings on it for about 30 miles, as I was ordered, after which I returned with my 34 men to St. John's the 23rd of August, 1778. Whether he was as successful as he claimed or not, it was John Peters' last command of the war. For the next 3 years, only small detachments drawn from all the corps under certain hand-picked officers would accompany British expeditions and raids into New York, particularly Robert Leake, an English-born New Yorker who had served as a captain under Colonel Francis Pfister. Never again would any entire battalion of Royalists go on an expedition. On January 23rd, 1779, Lord George Germain, one of the principal secretaries of state for America, wrote to his two commanders across the Atlantic, Haldeman in Quebec and Sir Henry Clinton at New York, informing them that His Majesty, as a reward for the services of the provincial regiments, could go on a new footing known as the American Establishment. All provincial regiments were eligible to obtain a higher status of sorts by going on the American Establishment. This status was to be conferred on those provincial units that had achieved their quota of men and had performed valuable services during the war. In return, the officers would have half pay after their regiments were disbanded at the end of the war, and their ranks would be made permanent in North America. They could also order their own uniforms from England. The biggest hurdle was each regiment had to be basically completed to 600 men. By 1780, none of the Royalist units could muster more than 125 to 150 men. Since taking command, Haldeman had forbidden the Royalist units from sending recruiting parties into the colonies. It was no secret he favored the King's Royal Regiment of New York and the immigrants, even having made the latter a regular British regiment at the end of 1778. But with Germain's letter, which he appears to have sat on as long as possible, he finally allowed them unfettered access to recruit, an attempt to get recruits and fill up their corps. In addition to not serving together in the field as a whole unit, the Royalist units didn't even all stay in the same garrison, being detached and parceled off as situations required, whether serving as Marines on board boats or more typically doing manual labor with one of the Army's civil branches. If you look at the screen, you will get an idea of where Peters' men were scattered in Quebec, leaving just 6 officers and 9 enlisted men present and fit for duty in the garrison. Not exactly an overwhelming force. In February 1781, at Fort St. John, Haldeman appointed officers to a board of inquiry to finally settle the matter of what soldiers in dispute belonged to what corps, a matter of friction for years, especially with somebody like John Peters, who was always claiming his men were absconded with by Pfister's corps. They interviewed 116 officers and men and adjudged them to the following corps. Just four went to the Queen's Loyal Rangers, 18 to the King's Loyal Americans, 16 to the late McAlpin's Corps. McAlpin died in July of 1780. 58 to Robert Leake's Corps, 2 to the Royal Highland Immigrants, and 18 to James Rogers' new King's American Rangers, including one found to be a deserter from the Susquehanna Chasseurs. This put an end, at least for the time being, of squabbling over who belonged to which unit. As long as regiments had to vie for recruits from the same small pool, the problem would never completely go away. While Peters generally liked the officers under his command, a pair of brothers would not be among those enjoying their commander's goodwill. Jeremiah and Gershom French, 2 of the officers originally given warrants by Montford Brown, who had joined Peters on his retreat from Bennington. He had these to say about the pair. Quote, Captain Jeremiah French is a man very ill-natured, came in at Skenesbury, is ruled by his wife, has been and still is mutinous and is complained of. That was mild compared to how Peters felt about his brother, Gershom French. Quote, Lieutenant Gershom French, now at Sorel, brother to Captain French, his character worse than his brother, was a clerk to a merchant at Albany, New City. It is said that he and others plundered both rebels and subjects. His wife and others, now in Canada, say that they have a fortune hid in the colonies, consisting of plates, cups, silver spoons, teapots. The complaint goes on for a full page, enumerating their selling the men's rations, cheating Peters out of money, men out of clothing, etc. Peters concluded, quote, I have been out of 40 pounds for these 2 years, having paid the merchants in Montreal. My family now suffers for it. Not a fan. On November 12, 1781, the process of disassembling the Royalist Court took place when Major Robert Leake, Captain Christian Ware, and Lieutenant Jeremiah French led 109 other ranks into the 2nd Battalion, King's Royal Regiment of New York, which had been raised the previous year. The men came from all the Royalists, but primarily from Leake's and McAlpin's. Jeremiah French was no doubt happy to remove from his old corps, having with his brother faced down 15 charges brought against them in 1781 by their commander. Gershom would not be joining him in the Yorkers, however. On 25 November 1781, the new Provincial Corps of Loyal Rangers was finally established. After years of limbo and efforts to complete the Royalist Corps, the surviving officers gave in to the inevitable and the consolidation took place. But command would not involve either Ebenezer Jessup or John Peters, both considered too frail to command. A 1784 list of officers noted that he was captain of an invalid due to his, quote, infirmities. Whether this was illness or the lingering effects of his wounds at Bennington is not stated. Quote, Mr. Edward Jessup's robust constitution, his personal activity, merit, and experience, having served last war, are circumstances which render him a fit person to command. In addition to Jessup, John Peters would officially be a captain, commanding most of the older men of the Corps, what was called the Invalid Company. In May 1782, the Corps expanded from its original 7 companies to 9, forming one under Captain Thomas Fraser and joining Captain John Walden Myers independently. Another officer continuing on in the new Loyal Rangers was Ensign John Peters, Jr., then about 20 years of age. Yet one more thing for Peters to rage at was the favoritism shown to Edward Jessup's son, promoted to lieutenant in June 1782. Quote, one thing omitted respecting my sons, who have served His Majesty against the American Rebellion. My son John, the eldest, ensign in the Queen's Loyal Rangers, was neglected by General Haldeman when he drafted the Provincial Corps in Canada, and a son of Major Jessup's, quite a boy, who had never done any service, was appointed lieutenant over my son and all the ensigns who had served all the war. Edward Jessup, Jr. was 16 when promoted to lieutenant. With a whopping 64 excess gentlemen, those who had served as officers as well as gentlemen volunteers, they officially became pensioners, receiving daily pay to either recruit anew or sit out the rest of the war on the sidelines. The vast majority, including a few who served under Peters, would opt for the latter. Now, the term invalid is period, but not exactly what it means today. They took most of the old or older men, and those clearly worn down, and formed them into one company under John Peters with the rank of captain. This was a nod to Peters' service ensuring that he would get permanent rank and half pay at the end of the war when the Corps was disbanded. It was, however, far less pay than that of a lieutenant colonel. The ranks of all the Royalist officers, though, prior to being formed into a provincial unit, were basically non-existent, as none of them actually ever got a commission, not in the Royalist Corps, whether it be from Carleton or Burgoyne or Haldeman or anyone else. They had been paid the equivalent of those ranks, but nothing more. They were never actually commissioned. They never got. And the commission, of course, is the legal document saying you're an officer. The Loyal Rangers passed into history on Christmas Eve, 1783, at the River du Chêne. Thankfully for them, Haldeman allowed everyone to still receive rations and remain under roof in quarters through the winter. The Loyalists would receive grants of land, but that would take time until surveyed and distributed. From this point on, John Peters Sr. and Jr. would both receive half pay for their respective ranks for the rest of their lives. As for the land, however, that's an insight. The discharge you see on the screen there is of Daniel Simmons of Rhinebeck in Dutchess County, New York. He was 17 years old and had only enlisted in the Rangers 4 months previous, in August 1783. Simmons was possibly the very last man to enlist in His Majesty's service in the Provincial Corps. A little bit of trivia there for you. Parliament, being stung by overwhelming Loyalist criticism of being abandoned by the British in the final peace treaty of 1783, passed an act for compensating Loyalists for their losses of real and personal property, professional income, and debt. One of the major issues, however, was that the claim had to be presented in London by March 25th, 1784. News of the act had only arrived in New York in October 1783, and in Quebec probably later still. This at a time when most Loyalists were desperate to find shelter for themselves and family before winter set in. Another impediment was needing proof of losses, things like deeds, appraisals, receipts, wills, etc. Going to England in person, Peters had none of those things. He still submitted a claim, however, for the loss of 2,735 pounds, all but 330 of which was real estate. He hoped for a better account once paperwork arrived from Vermont. The 1780s would not be kind to John Peters. First, there was the issue of the land the Loyal Rangers would settle on. According to Peters, General Haldeman, who also ruled as governor of Quebec, insisted they settle on land at the Bay of Chaleur or at Cataraqui. Not all were for that, however, and naturally Peters was among them. Quote, the Loyalists then petitioned the governor for leave to settle in Cape Breton, that's Nova Scotia. The governor, having heard that I had drawn the petition, sent for me and told me that I was the supposed author of it, and in a passion treated me with great indignity. I told him no man but the commander-in-chief should treat me so. He added, I will allow the Loyalists nothing. They shall settle on these lands I have allowed for them, or I will send them back to the rebels. His threatening terrified some, and they settled on such lands as he chose. But I and my family left Canada on October 17th, with many others to get rid of such a petty tyrant. And we arrived at last at Cape Breton. Here I left my wife and children in a fisherman's house, under the protection of Peter the Indian, King of Cape Breton, who had more honor than 2 Swiss governors. And I went to Halifax. In August 1785, Sir Charles Douglas, who knew me in Canada, generously brought me with him to England. After borrowing £100 to leave his family in his absence, Peter would go to England to press his claims, despite being past the deadline. He would never return. From 1785 to 88, John Peters would spend his days in the Pimlico section of London, writing the Claims Commission and those who could support his claims, which included reuniting with his uncle Samuel, who assisted him. His claim was not settled or decided upon before his death on January 11, 1788, at the age of 47. Writing shortly before his death, he seemingly wrote his own epitaph. Quote, I cannot say that I look back with regret at the part I took for motives of loyalty and from a foresight of the horrors and miseries of independency. Though I never imagined they would be so great as they now are. Yet I thought the part I took right, and I certainly think so still from my love of my country, as well as duty to my sovereign, and notwithstanding my sufferings and services and scandalous treatment by General Haldeman, I would do it again if there was occasion. It is true, I see persons who were notorious on the rebel side who are now here and taken notice of and advanced, while I am neglected and deprived of even what is justly done to me. But with the consciousness of having done right, I can look with disdain at the triumph of successful villainy. Gee, I wonder who he's talking about there. With that, I'll be happy to take any questions you now have. I will simply point out I am not a genealogist. I'm a military researcher. So if you're going to ask me who his wife's cousin was, I don't know. So please don't ask me that question. David, do we have anyone who wants to ask a question?
Yes, we may. So I would suggest for any of our participants in the meeting now, if you would like, you can type out a question in chat, which we will read off on the video stream here for our lecturer. If you do not see a chat panel, you can just sort of hover your cursor, if you're on a desktop or laptop, toward the bottom of the program. There is a little chat icon. You can also press Alt-H to bring up the chat window and go ahead and type your question if you have one now. So that is a little bit of a perk to, catching this lecture live as it debuts. So please feel free to post your questions. And as we wait for any of our audience to share a question, a couple do just occur to me, if you'll indulge. Firstly, I've always wondered, prior to the convention, as the Loyalists are wisely, most likely, seeking their escape to avoid, capture. I've always found it interesting. I've never come across a document that records any of these men failing to make good on their escape from Burgoyne's army, and it just seems statistically unlikely that so many men could sneak through the woods without American pickets intercepting them or anything like that. So I just wondered if you had any insight to offer on their escape to Canada.
It's an excellent point. And it makes you wonder if I think the total number that did escape up to Canada was around 267, something like that. Primarily Peters Corps and Pfisters under Samuel McKay. How did they do it? And could more have done it? If, all of a sudden, the 24th Regiment of Foot says, we want to try this, could they have tried? I'm not sure how well Brunswickers would have done, but, certainly Jessup certainly seems to have stayed pretty much whole with Burgoyne. Hardly any of them went up to Canada before the convention, but I have not read any accounts of anyone being captured. Samuel McKay did leave a journal of bringing his guys north. I confess I did not look at that beforehand. That was really a part of this. He may mention some instances in which they had skirmishes or whatnot. I will check that and get back to you if that's okay.
Oh, wonderful. Again, if anybody has a question, please feel free to type. I will also just ask a second question. I think oftentimes when we, especially with the benefit of hindsight, the fact that presumably most of the participants on this call today are, Americans. We're citizens of a nation that has existed for now coming up on 250 years. At the time of the revolution, it had existed, well, TBD. So I just wonder, everyone always, especially modern people, are curious about the motivations of loyalists. It's a question I get very often interpreting the battle here. What caused people to, throw in their lot with the king rather than Congress? And I just wonder, in Peter's case in particular, I think you referenced his uncle several times, and I've heard it said that in the Peters family, the uncle was sort of uh, maybe a bad influence on Peters, and that it was ultimately him that sort of instilled some of these sentiments in his nephew. Perhaps owing to the fact he was an Anglican clergy, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, yes.
So I just wonder, what your take is. What do you believe led Peters to do what he did?
Um, it's a good question. By good question, of course, I mean it's a hard question. Um, it's the question of motivation is probably the most common question people ask. Because looking at it from the perspective of somebody in 2026, we know how everything turned out, but they certainly didn't then. So people ask, well, why wasn't everyone for the revolution? Well, it was a lot more complex back then, um, and it's the one thing they don't write about. You've probably gone through a number of claims yourself, and they'll use just standard lines like brought up under the under the best of kings or something like that. Not really saying how it affects them in their day-to-day life, and maybe that tells us something right there that government really wasn't a part of day-to-day life for a lot of people. You know, I think I love our friends in Boston and whatnot, but I think sometimes the things that affect them we take for granted affected everybody. And that really wasn't the case. What the Americans did wonderfully was make it the case, even if it wasn't entirely um, true or reflective of what was going on. You know, united we stand, all that good stuff. But in an actual reality, what's going on in Boston may not affect in any way, shape, or form somebody in Sussex County, New Jersey. But you make him feel like it does, and you've got everyone on your side. Well, somebody like John Peters, um, and I think a lot of people, particularly of the more working class, listen to people of influence. This is a time when we don't think all men are created equal. The well-educated person. Both these guys were college graduates, but if you were a tenant farmer and somebody down the road from you had graduated college and he lived on 1,000 acres of land and as opposed to your 50 acres of land, and His cops were great, and he always knew what was going on in the assembly. His wife wore the latest fashion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you go to the tavern and you see him there with other gentlemen, and he's holding a discussion of who to vote for in the assembly, well, maybe that's who I should vote for in the assembly. And war comes, and he's saying that, George Washington is right, or he's saying King George is right. Maybe that's in your mind now, that's how things should be. Because what do you know? You just own 50 acres of land, and this guy owns 1,000. He knows what he's talking about. I don't. I know it sounds simplistic, but they don't put down other reasons for things. And when they give out warrants to raise men, who are they giving warrants out to? Not the guy with the 50 acres. They're giving it out to the guy with the 1,000 acres because he has influence. He also has the money to provide for these people before being reimbursed, if they get reimbursed. So that he could be influenced by his uncle. Well, his father sure thought so, and didn't, and wasn't shy about saying so. So in that case, we'll believe Dad, and it's Father's Day tomorrow, so why not?
Sounds reasonable.
Mm.
So in the chat, we have not had any questions, but we've had two comments. Tom McAndrew says, nice presentation as always. And Matt Reardon says, additionally, great job, Todd, and includes the pronunciation of Hebron, Connecticut as Hebron for future reference. So
I will bow to
that
the
as well.
Connecticut. I will bow to my Connecticut Yankee friend. If you haven't read Matt's book yet on the attack on Fort Griswold in New London, do so. So it's an excellent account.
Very good. All right. Well, on that note, thank everyone who attended today. This lecture will be shared to YouTube and Facebook following the conclusion. So if you know someone who was interested in checking it out and wasn't able to today, you'll be able to share that link. And of course, I would also like to thank our lecturer, Mr. Todd Braisted. I'll echo the sentiments of the chat. Excellent, excellent presentation today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dave, and thank you everyone for coming.
All righty. Take care, everyone.